Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kathleen. Where's Kathleen? Kathleen, were you or Rob gonna say any introductory remarks, or shall I just introduce what? Okay. Yep. Good. Okay. So this is the first public workshop for what is called Ojai Neighborhood Planning Phase 1. Over the years, the city and the Planning Commission and others, and the City Council, have noticed that sometimes new development or remodeling. Oh, feel free to take that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. That's what it's for. And more of those little plans are coming. We're going to have a lot more to pass around. There was a mix-up on the quantity, and you don't need them yet. We're going to show you some stuff first, and then we're going to ask you to talk about what you think of what we're showing you. So, over the years, over a lot of years, folks have noticed that sometimes new development, whether it's commercial development or new housing or somebody remodels a property, or when street improvements get made to make traffic go better or fix the pavement or whatever. Sometimes the new construction doesn't seem to fit in or enhance what people think of as the unique design character and small town, village scale and character of Ojai. So, there's some simple reasons for that, which is that small cities with small budgets, when they adopt street standards or zoning standards, tend to look at what other cities nearby are doing, and they sort of borrow those standards. Sometimes they just borrow them completely. Sometimes they borrow them and make little adjustments. But for a place that's as unique and quirky and weird, in the best possible sense of the word weird, as Ojai, the off-the-shelf standards that other communities use when they're going to build new housing or new shopping center or make a new street, just don't. What are the chances that you would be so lucky that those would build stuff that fits in with Ojai? Well, they don't. So the purpose of this planning effort in the over the next probably 2-3 years is to update the standards that you use to make your streets and to update the zoning standards that shape residential and commercial downtown, edge of town development. The city had applied for a number of grants from state agencies and such. There's sustainable community grants that are available that you didn't luck out at getting yet. And so the city council allocated a starter budget to start to, as a community, think about, well, how do we want the town to turn out? What are the characteristics of streets? What are the characteristics of the frontages, the way the buildings connect to your streets? Where do we want sidewalks? Where do we want paths? Et cetera? Where do we want curbs and gutters? Where do we want ditches? Because it's a rural street. So the purpose of this phase 1 that we're working on is to just talk with you about what makes Ojai Ojai, and essentially come up with a to-do list for when you update your zoning. And the city engineer recently came upon a little piece of money that they hadn't known they had, which was allocated to our friends. This is Steve Boland. From Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. I didn't introduce myself. I'll do that one second. First things first. Well, what's most important is what we're doing for you, and then next is who we are. So their firm was hired to do a more thorough job of something that was a little piece of our scope, which was to start to think about how to make your streets more balanced in terms of how they accommodate cars, how they accommodate pedestrians, how they accommodate bicycles, how they accommodate, in some cases, horses. Your streets and trail network. So there's a separate process, well, it's a separate but connected process that you may have already participated in some. There was a complete streets workshop 6 weeks or so ago that these folks conducted, which is intimately connected with what we're doing. So we're going to show you a presentation that we think summarizes how we're seeing Ojai and its many different kinds of neighborhoods. And then we want you to tell us if we're on the right track or where we're off the track and what's most important about the way Ojai is designed. I'm David Sargent. My company is Sargent Town Planning. I started that company 20 years ago in Ventura. I've been an architect practicing in California since the early 80s. Have been living in Ventura County since 1981. We've done a lot of work in Ventura for the downtown revitalization that's been coming along. I sort of started that off by talking the city council into funding a downtown plan about 25 years ago, and 15 or 20 years later, it was an overnight success. Just a few years ago, we moved our offices to downtown Los Angeles because we're working a lot of places, and that's an easier place to attract the smart young people that I need working with me. So the city selected us, along with Nelson Nygaard, to help you think about the way that your streets and your neighborhoods, your residential development, your commercial development, all work together to make, on the one hand, to make one town, but on the other hand, to make a whole bunch of different unique parts of town. Because so for starters, your zoning already isn't really set up to make Ojai. But even if it was, which part of Ojai would it be making? Would it be making more downtown Ojai? Well, that wouldn't be okay in the neighborhoods. Or would it be making more neighborhood like the center of town? Well, that wouldn't be okay out on Gridley at the edge. So we have to find out what it is that is common to all the different parts of town and what unique characteristics are important to preserve and build new and enhance in the different parts of town. Okay, enough of that. So I just told you the first one. We're going to go through quickly what we heard so far. We had interviews with a bunch of folks that wanted to talk to us initially, and the city staff had, some planning commissioners and such that have been thinking about this a lot. Then we're going to go through a few slides that we think capture a lot of what is unique and important about Ojai. Then we're going to ask you to think about and give us some feedback on how close we are or are not to being right about that. Then we're going to do another little segment that sort of takes it area by area in a little more detail, not a lot more detail, but enough more detail that we can start to think about what street or zoning standards would want to do in each of those parts of town. And then we're going to do a little piece on the streets just to tie in to what Nelson Nygaard have been doing on the complete streets. I've told you that. So we're going to come up with a clear idea of what you want the downtown to be like, what you want neighborhood centers to be like, what you want the different neighborhoods to be like. what are the pieces and parts that these kinds of streetscapes and parts of town are made out of? We're gonna get consensus with y'all today, I hope, in general, about what are the different parts of town from a design character standpoint, and then end up with a framework that'll help inform the code update. What we've heard so far from people that we've spoken with, and what we just have known from being sort of informal students of Ojai for a long time, is that the small-scale village character is a very important thing to preserve, and that it is a diverse and eclectic town, and that sort of cleaning it up isn't the goal. That a lot of the neighborhoods are different and unique from each other, that trees are a very big part of Ojai's character, starting with the original settlements, which so carefully preserved the oaks and either wound streets around them or built streets around them. And that a lot of the town should be navigable not only by foot and bike, but also by horse. That cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all zoning doesn't do it. That front yards shouldn't have big fences around them, especially in the arbolada, where the streetscape sort of flows out into all the yards, and it's that overall sense of greenery and shade and landscape that makes the arbolada what it is. That we need to think carefully about the heights that buildings should be in the different parts of town. There's some places that height would be would damage the character. There's some places that height might make a nice place. The second unit ordinance about where you're allowed to have a second dwelling should be revisited, perhaps, in terms of where they're allowed and the standards by which they would be constructed, so that they provide a nice additional place for somebody to have a relatively affordable place to live, but not impinging on the privacy and quiet of neighbors. And we heard a lot of people have mentioned that affordable housing is something that would benefit the community, and second units done beautifully could help that. We're also aware of the Airbnb issue of houses and second units being turned into rental properties essentially by the day or the week. And that isn't the main focus of what we're talking about today, but that's certainly something that we can hear from you about, and there's going to be another meeting that's going to address that more directly. We've heard that the intersection pedestrian crosswalk at Cañada Street is dangerous and needs to be fixed, and we think some of that's underway. That a lot of people ride their bikes on the sidewalks because they're not comfortable riding in the street, and there's ways to slow the cars down. That it should be more bike friendly in general, but downtown parking options need to be looked at carefully. So those are the sorts of things we've heard so far, and we expect to hear a bunch more from you today. So for starters, you've got an amazing rural valley in which Ojai happens, and not screwing that up is probably one of the most important things. Within that rural valley, an amazing sort of town center setting was built, first in the wooden version that didn't make it, and then rebuilt as the arcade that you have today, originally with angled parking on the street. Could be again, actually. And over the years, that has been beautifully preserved, and I know, how long ago was it? Like 15 years, maybe more, that the restoration of the arcade occurred, and I followed with great interest the lively discussions about how that would happen, and it was done beautifully. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the very green, naturalistic incredibly well-designed arbolada that was designed in the sort of the high point of American town design in the between 1900 and 1920. It comes out of what's called the City Beautiful movement, where it was suburbs thought of as truly integrating housing with nature. And most of the suburbs that have been built since then are marketed as though they were doing that. And guess what? They're not. The difference being that in this case, and in the case of the Santa Paula Oaks, which you may be familiar with down the hill, they took a beautiful oak grove site and turned it into a neighborhood without erasing the oak grove. Most newer housing developments have names like Oak Knoll or, or Vista del Rancho or I don't know what, but they're named after the thing that they demolished in order to build a lot of houses. And in this kind of neighborhood, they managed to build a lot of houses without demolishing the thing that made the land valuable to begin with. So I think a lot of what we need to think about here is how the town continues to grow and evolve, but beyond not destroying Ojai's essential character, it needs to make Ojai's essential character better and better. So you've got the rural environment, and I know that's not in the city, that's just outside the city, but you've got that sort of rural edge character that fades into neighborhoods with large lots and big trees and no curbs along the edge of the street that give you the very soft, semi-rural character. Then you have the harder edged, and in the very best possible way, character of Ojai Avenue, where it's definitely, you're in town. There's no question, not only are you in town, you're in the middle of town. And you know it, you don't need signs to tell you. It's just the middle of town. And then there's a lot of neighborhoods that were built by the more normal suburban standards, where there's a lot of very nice houses. The streets tend to be wider. Some of them have sidewalks, some of them don't. So one of the things that will be important to talk about today and after is to what extent do streets like that over time get adjusted in any ways to make them a little more, because that street could be sort of a lot of places. It's not a bad street, it's just more of an off-the-shelf kind of a street than most of Ojai's streets. So a question would that over time want to become different in some subtle ways, or it's just, it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so what we're going to talk a lot about is frontages. Because if you just step back and look at how Ojai is developed, it's all pretty low density, and it's all pretty much 1- and 2-story buildings. So the differences between downtown and the older, shadier neighborhoods and the newer, less shady neighborhoods, the differences are subtle and hard to put into rules, which is why there aren't rules yet. That's why we have to think harder about this. And so the difference is, probably the most important difference is the frontages. It's, between these one, or in a few cases 2-story, between these buildings and the street, what are we looking at? Are we looking at a lawn? Are we looking at a low wall? Are we looking at shade trees? Do we have trees? Do we have trees in this space between the moving traffic and the front yard? In this case, it's emphatically, it's very clear. The space is defined by buildings, and very lovely ones. And well, why aren't there street trees? Well, in this kind of an environment, you don't need street trees. One of the purposes of street trees is to sort of define the space. so that you feel like you're in town rather than on the road. Well, in this case, the space is very clearly defined by very lovely buildings. Now, would a tree there be nice? Maybe, I don't know. But you don't need them because the buildings are doing that. Then you've got these just perfect houses and frontages where, I mean, you'd look at, on the one hand, you'd look at this and say, oh, there's just a tiny little sidewalk. But it's fine. You can walk along it, but the space you're looking at is this beautiful front yard with a little privacy provided for the house. You've got beautiful landscape that fits with the climate, that doesn't use too much water. So it's simple stuff. But if somebody came in and did, if somebody came in and did like a berm with turf on it and, flowering shrubs or something, it wouldn't be as nice as this simple thing. So the question is, do you want, in some neighborhoods, to have guidelines that suggest either gently or more, how front yards are designed? It's a question. I'm not saying you need to do it. In this case, I think not only do you not need a sidewalk, I would suggest that putting a curb and a sidewalk here would probably change the character in a way that wasn't beneficial. Because what makes this feel so rural, obviously, is the curving road, the lack of sidewalks, and the big oak trees. So we want to talk about those characteristics sort of area by area to see which things you think it would be good to have somehow controlled versus which things you should just leave up to the property owner. Here coming into town, you've got what we think is a very beautiful, simple kind of rural road, edge of road coming into town, again with the cobbles, with the natural landscaping, with the big oak trees and the simple signage. If somebody came in here with one of those concrete slab monument signs with, red letters on it, it would, I think it would change the way this looks a lot. A lot of the sidewalks aren't concrete. They're made out of a decomposed granite or a granular material. There's advantages and there's disadvantages. This requires a little more maintenance than concrete, but it's softer, and we think that with that sort of landscape is a very nice option for a lot of parts of town. Would you want that down by the arcade? Probably not. So where would you want things like that? The fact that you've got some streets where they just left the tree seems to us like an exceptionally good move. And then there's other neighborhoods where there's low walls and they're made out of beautiful materials. So the question is, well, what if that wall was 2 or 3 feet higher? Would that change the quality of that neighborhood in a negative way? Well, obviously, I think we probably don't need to look at the possibility of making it out of chain link. But what if it was white plaster? What if it was white painted wood? What if it was the PVC white plastic fence material? I don't know. So those are the kinds of things we can talk about. Again, just very, very soft edges. And then downtown, you get buildings up closer to the street. Somebody could look at this and say, well, does that meet the setback requirements? Well, when you're in the middle of town, that's probably just the perfect setback to have. But what if this building was set back that far all the way across there? Maybe not. Maybe the fact that this building is set back behind a little yard and then some of the buildings on the property come right up to the street, but not for like 100 feet in a row. Maybe that's a pattern that's important. That isn't a pattern that's in your zoning. So maybe that's something that could be addressed. Then you've got, you know, where characters collide, and we know this is in the county, not in, but here you've got, and nobody was trying to do a bad thing here. The county road guys had made the road wider, going back south, or west, mostly south. And then they didn't keep going. Well, thank goodness they didn't keep going. And, you know, over time, there's probably a more graceful way to make that transition. But this is just an illustration of the fact that, you know, the standards that build big suburban places and the standards that build Ojai are just different. So which do you apply where, and how do you deal with places where they sort of bump into each other? On Ojai Avenue itself, which is a focus of the work that the Complete Streets folks are talking about, and we can talk about that a little later, but we don't want this to go on and on and on, so we didn't add their slides in. You know, so we're just looking at this and thinking, well, you could probably at least get bike lanes on the sides. That road's plenty wide. And then you've got the public street is out here, and then what's next to it is the private frontage, and it's not, that private frontage isn't really screaming Ojai in its current configuration. So if that did have to be I've never seen a car parked there. But anyway, if you do need to have a parking area there, perhaps there's other ways that it could be designed that would look more like Ojai, or would it be nicer if the building was up closer to the street and the parking was somehow not in front of it? Here's an interesting situation that looks to us like low-hanging fruit. And I think this is something that the transportation guys are addressing. Here you've got a pretty wide street, and it looks to us like there's plenty of room to have parking in front there, but you've got this no stopping any time sign here. The developer made nice front doors on the buildings, but they're all pretty much locked up with a little sign that says, you know, go around to the back where the parking lot is. So by thinking about the way the street's made and thinking about the zoning sort of all in one breath, which is really why we're here, is you could think, well, you know, that's pretty nice. You've got front doors there. Wouldn't it be nice if somebody could park there and, you know, come in? And as I said before, in some places like this where you've got sort of pieces and parts, you've got some sidewalk and then you've got some no sidewalk. So, you know, what does this street want to be when it grows up? Because a lot of these places are in their awkward teenage years, and maybe we're not telling you what the answer should be. We're just asking the question. You know, maybe in some cases, you know, a tree or two would just solve any problem that you thought there was. And then in other places, the regulations have been unhelpful in a number of ways. So here, for instance, there's an interesting little spot where you could have had 2 or 3 on-street parking spaces there, and the reason they're not there is there's 2 or 3 parking spaces on the lot there. So, you know, theoretically, if you just closed up that curb cut, you could have a little dining patio there, and you wouldn't have lost any parking spaces. But again, it's about thinking about the way the streets are made and thinking about the zoning all in one breath. Because the way the zoning's set up now, the parking that's required has to be on your site. And the street parking doesn't count toward the parking for your little restaurant. And so that's why they paved their front yard and put cars in it, because the rules said you had to. And if the rules said you didn't have to, and it would look a lot more, obviously, if that were a little dining patio, or even if they expanded their building out to there, that would look a lot more like downtown Ojai than this existing situation. So that's the end of our first little spiel. And the question is, did we, you know, are we on the right track? What of the things we showed, or what similar things that we didn't show, do you think are really great examples of the way Ojai ought to turn out? Did we show something there and say nice things about it that you think we shouldn't have been saying such nice things about? And are there any specific streets? And when we say streets, we don't just mean the paving. We mean the street and what's along it in terms of like just a place to be or a part of town that feels like Ojai. Are there some that you think are especially great or not that great and could use help? Some of the more conventional suburban neighborhoods that we showed, you know, in general, should they just be left alone, or are there little things that could improve them, like maybe crosswalks or a few more trees or more continuous sidewalks, bike lanes? And we're going to talk mostly about the bike lane stuff in the transportation process, but everything's open here. So we'll stop talking for a moment and ask you to, well, you can ask me any questions you want right now. We can talk just as a larger group for a sec, and then you could have discussions around your tables about the different things we showed, and then maybe do that for like 15 minutes or so, or until you're bored. And then we'll go on to the next little set of slides and talk more specifically about what the different parts of town are and what are the most important characteristics for them. Anything, burning questions or comments before we start the, yes ma'am?
Process-oriented.
Yep.
I really feel like the bike part of it needs to be part of it instead of being separate.
Oh.
For example, you showed past liquors and said, well, they could park on the street,
Yeah,
they have a little dining area.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when they're parked on the streets and the car door is open and the bicyclist goes by and so I think we can put this together instead of having two separate.
Oh, we're going to. We wanted at this. Absolutely, we're going to. What we didn't want to bog this first conversation down with too much detail. We wanted to see what you folks think about. We're going to show you our thoughts about how these different character areas map themselves onto your town in the next little section. So we're hoping to get mostly that big picture stuff about, are the parts of town defined approximately right, and are we correct or need to be corrected on the main issues? And that's a very great one. And Steve can speak about the bike stuff in a little, but if we could just start with what are the most important issues? Yes, ma'am.
The timeline.
Yeah.
So we're doing this now.
Yep.
And then is it all about zoning and maybe getting some grants, or what is your timeline?
The timeline for this is we're going to have this workshop.
Pass this around.
Oh, of course, yeah. One. We're going to, based on what we hear from you over the next couple of months, we're going to tighten things up and come back to you with a map that we think, well, a refined version of what we're starting with, a map that we think has the different, you know, what the sort of in-town neighborhood, the edge of town neighborhood, the arbolada, the other kind of neighborhood areas, and the main characteristics that it's important to preserve in those areas. We're going to bring that back, and at that time we're going to integrate it with the more detailed transportation stuff of bike network, pedestrian network, recommended street cross sections. Yes, sir.
It's the goal then to eventually develop idiosyncratic zoning for each of the identified areas?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And that could take a bunch of forms. And those will depend on what we hear. So the first question is, how far off is your existing zoning? And so one way would be to just do some overlay zones, because if your existing single-family zoning says you can have a house and a second unit on here, and it can be 2 stories high and it's got to be set back. Then we might have, for a certain area, we might have an overlay zone, not in this phase of work, but in the next. We might have an overlay zone that says, well, all of the single-family zoning criteria apply, and in this neighborhood, the front setbacks are usually 30 feet, not less. And then in town, you could say, well, the front yard setbacks on the nicest houses are like 10 or 15 feet. So we could do overlay zoning that essentially overrides the one-size-fits-all in specific ways in specific areas. And it may be that there's some areas where the existing zoning and what you want are just really pretty different, in which case we could either amend the zone that currently applies to them, or we could just make a new zone. Like, for instance, for downtown, my guess is you probably just want a new zone that says exactly what you want, because that's such an important, unique place. But so we'll see. Yes, the idea is to make sure that the zoning fits each part of town. Yes, sir.
So I have 2 things.
Yep.
First of all, we're talking about planning and zoning.
Yes.
All of these elements.
Yes.
And yet we've never really had a true discussion of what the vision of this community is.
Well, this is supposed to be that discussion.
Well, it's not titled as the vision of Ojai, so that's why.
Okay.
That's just one issue that,
Uh-huh.
as a community,
Yep.
we just have never had that clear discussion as to what is our vision today as well as in the future.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Okay.
The second thing is the disconnect of the downtown corridor from the west end to the east end.
Yes.
Our downtown seems to stop at Montgomery,
Absolutely.
and there's no connection between everything east of Montgomery to everything west.
We couldn't agree
And
more.
So that should be, to me, one of our primary, again, one of the focuses is how we connect those two as well as develop them down the road.
Okay.
Again, I didn't want to overdo the me talking thing here, but one of the deliverables that we're going to have for a subsequent workshop is going to be a vision plan drawing of Ojai Avenue and the downtown, suggesting how the street, sidewalk, and bike lane and crosswalk situation could be improved, and illustrating different sorts of infill buildings. So for instance, where you have like a big parking lot, and you would hope that later on it wouldn't be a big parking lot right on Ojai Avenue. We're going to illustrate what kinds of buildings could fill that in. So, yeah, it'll be very clear illustrations. Yeah, yes?
We have to use the
Oh,
microphone.
yeah, okay.
So it picks up on the tape.
Yeah, okay, good.
So-
I could talk better without being on.
Well,
Oh,
Oh.
oh,
They're on the television, that's everybody.
they're trying to record
for,
it,
yeah.
so they have a record of the
Okay.
meeting.
Just like a,
Well, you showed a picture of the Rancho Inn there on
Yes.
Ojai Avenue.
Yes.
And it's lovely with the rocks there.
It is.
But they had a public thing last fall sometime where there were a lot of people coming and going, and there was no place to walk, really. I think,
There you go.
like Randy said, along Main Street, there ought to be a sidewalk on both sides all the way up and down.
Okay,
I think
okay,
that
we're
would-
writing all this down.
And as far as crosswalks, there should be a couple more that have those blinking lights where people stop and wait to cross the street rather than streaming,
Yeah.
all day long. They have to stop and wait for a group and then they can go.
Right.
Push a little button.
Yeah, good, thank you very much.
thank you.
Yeah, in the next workshop, we're going to have a bunch of very specific stuff about Ojai Avenue and the downtown.
Behind you here, David.
Yeah, I'm troubled by this
Okay.
process.
Yeah.
I'm troubled in the sense that ultimately, if it goes forward as you anticipate, this planning will reflect itself in coercion. It will reflect itself in laws and zoning and so forth and so on. And yet, that will be based on what 30 people out of thousands have said. That doesn't seem right to me. It seems anti-democratic. Moreover, don't we have existing systems in place, planning commissions and the rest, and ways that we can approach our local government to address these particular problems?
Yes, you sure do. And continuing as you are is certainly continuing with the existing systems in place is certainly a valid option. What a lot of communities we've worked in have found is that what you're describing is what's generally called the plan development overlay process. And that's what about in the 1970s, when cities started to realize that if you just built things according to their zoning code, almost everybody hated them. The first 30-year attempt was to say, okay, we'll put a plan development overlay on this so that when somebody comes in with a project that just meets our zoning and we hate it, we can have a lot of planning commission meetings, and out of all those Tuesday night meetings, we're pretty sure something we like will emerge. And what a lot of communities found is that, well, sometimes something that they really liked emerged, and very often what emerged was something that nobody hated enough to sue over it, and then they built it. So, but more to the point, the decisions that were reached on, site A through 15 planning commission meetings didn't necessarily go together really well with the development that was approved 5 years later next door to it based on another 15 planning commission meetings. So a lot of communities have been deciding to back up and do this sort of a process to try to get an overall vision, as you said, sir, of how they want the whole town to turn out. And then based on that vision of how they want the whole town to turn out, can go back and fine-tune their zoning. We're certainly not saying that your zoning is all, well, we don't have any idea. We're not saying your zoning is all wrong. We're not saying that it needs to be replaced. We're not here to tell you, maybe what comes out of this is just some guidelines. We don't know what the output of this is, but if the goal we're imagining for this process is exactly as you said, sir, which is to have a clear vision of how you all want the different parts of town to turn out, and then come up with a systematic way that fits your community's desires in terms of how to implement that in some systematic way. And it might just be by having this vision to inform the planning commission process. That might be all it is. It might be some guidelines. It might be some adjustments to the zoning. Very possibly it's some combination of those things. Yes, sir.
Go here first.
You didn't make any mention of the trails in town. The Ojai Valley Trail goes all the way through the city.
Yes, it does.
And then it comes out on Ojai Avenue and skirts across Soul Park. And that's a dirt area. As an equestrian and also as a runner, I'm always looking for dirt.
Yeah.
We have some dirt on Grand Avenue on the south side, but it's interrupted by pavement.
Right.
I like the dirt.
Yep. Yep.
And so we have a discontinuity, and it seems to me we have an opportunity as well. You have the main corridor going down Ojai Avenue is developed, sidewalked as it needs to be. But we do have that part by Soul Park that still wants to be dirt. We have the Ojai Valley Trail to the south of town. We have Grand Avenue to the north of town. And it seems an opportunity exists there to have a trail on Grand Avenue.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see that talked about. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Who's next? Oh. Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure. And then you, ma'am. And then you.
In following up on what he just said,
Yeah.
since we moved in town in 1969, we were lucky enough to live with a family lived up on Gridley, the Armstrongs, and he always used to tell me that he was positive there was a dedicated easement through town down Grand Avenue, as he just described, but it also went through the Arbolata on Cuyama Road all the way to the Y. And I know that there's a large section of property, by evidence by everybody's fences set back, And if there's a possibility of exploring that avenue for another throughway, as he's talking about on the north sort of town for bikes, walking, and maybe horses, that might be worth investigating, because I don't think those people own that property. It's still an easement.
Well, we're in the
Outside of Cuyama.
Yes, the Yama itself is a pedestrian hazard. It's a thoroughfare, you can't walk, you can't bike down that road.
Well, there's actually some things you could do to Cuyama that we're going to talk about in the transportation one, but so that is being looked at right now, and there's going to be a when is the next Complete Streets workshop, Steve? Okay, so there will be there will be a second Complete Streets workshop that will talk about that in quite a bit of detail, and we will report back to you all about that in the next one of these workshops for sure. Thank you. Yes. Oh.
I have a question. You've used the word zoning a whole bunch.
Yeah.
And is this going to change, like zoning from R1, R2, and so on? Because looking at your character trait maps, I'm in an R1 zone, but it looks like I'm lumped into a multi or village mixed use area, and I'm unhappy about that.
No, we're not suggesting
that zoning is different than this zoning.
We're not suggesting that these colors represent necessarily zones that would happen. We're seeing that a lot of the sort of the streetscape character is similar in some of those, but one of the main things we're here to do today is have you mark stuff up and tell us what needs to be separate versus what can be similar. So yeah, these are a sort of a first shot at what we would call neighborhood character maps, which is related to but certainly not the same as zoning.
But are the zoning lines going to be changed with the?
I would think probably not.
Okay.
I would think probably not. There would be some. We think that there. So zoning's a tricky thing. Conventional zoning, the way it's practiced in most of California, and thank goodness not so much in Ojai, is about separating things from each other. It's a system that was set up to make sure that all the commercial stuff is in one tight little box here, and then all the residential stuff is in a tight little box over here, and then the multifamily is in a tight little box up here, and the condos is in a tight little box. And so that tends to generate places like Orange County, where it's not so much a town as it's sort of a bag of projects, where the streets wander around and, oh, I live in that project. Well, Ojai is not a project, it's a town. So the trick with zoning is to not separate everything too much, but as you point out, not blurring things that need to be different into one thing. So again, we need to start with the vision of, yeah, I like to be a block and a half away from multifamily, but I don't want somebody building an apartment next door to me. And then the zoning needs to be subtle enough to reflect that. There's one of our favorite quotes from Mr. Einstein is that everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And zoning tends to be simpler. And so we're trying to make it just complicated enough to start to describe Ojai, if you want. And it doesn't have to be the zoning, it could be other things. Yes, ma'am.
Somehow I would like to have
the age of the house or the building to be a consideration outside of the issue of zoning, because there are houses in the village mixed use that are over 100 years old.
Right.
You can't lump them in and say, oh, they're just VMU. They have something very special and different about them. So
That's
however
easy to
we do this, I would really like to have the age of the building and this historical significance of it outside of this VMU or whatever zone they're in be a consideration.
That's easy to do, yes.
If we're going to embrace quirky, we can't embrace regimentation. They're not the same thing. And I think that's going to be the subtle challenge here.
That's the balancing act.
That's going to be the subtle challenge here. I think this
act.
gentleman had it exactly right.
Yeah.
That if we're going to implement, regimented standards in all these different neighborhoods, that's not what we want, I don't think, if we're going to continue to embrace quirky. So there's going to be a challenge there.
Absolutely.
And again, that's, of course, what we're all looking to you for, to hear that expression of,
Yep.
I think, that many of us share, and figure out how to prevent eroding the character without, at the same time, sacrificing the larger quirky, eccentric, eclectic aspect of Ojai.
We're not
So,
suggesting that
then I have
we're
a
not
follow-up
suggesting that there's a formula
Yeah.
that is going to come up that everybody in each neighborhood has to follow. We're not suggesting that. But there's the instructions that physicians are given also applies to zoning. First, do no harm. So you don't want the zoning to tie your hands so that you can't do a beautiful, funky building, but you also don't want the zoning to give somebody the legal right to build something that you're all just going to hate.
A 3-story wall right next to it.
Yeah, right. So it has to be, so the zoning has to be, for starters, zoning has to not be describing something you hate. And then how much you make it describe the things you want has to be calibrated really carefully. And you're right, both of you are right. In Ojai, you don't want to have it micromanaging details. You want a lot of those decisions to be left up to the architect, to the property owner, to the neighborhood, to the town.
And another part of quirky is the arbolata is not just inside the city. It's really interesting. We have a general plan which defines the city's sphere of influence over the entire arbolata, but our city limits are only about half.
Right.
And so I've gotten different opinions. If I've asked about to what extent, what does that mean, sphere of influence, in terms of being able to provide some sort of guidance to county inside sphere of influence, and I'm not getting clarity at all what that means.
There's a lot of places that's an issue around the county.
And all I'm saying is whatever guidance you can give us as to how to structure whatever we do to enhance the sphere of influence outcome that I think we all want, I'm very confused about how we can implement that part of the general plan.
Well, the good news on that side is, in my opinion, but having worked for the county recently on a little planning assignment in Satakoy, which is another little town that sort of been badly damaged by bad zoning over a long period of time. The current folks that are running the county planning department are a lot better at thinking about these things than 10 or 15 years ago. They're thinking about those. So that's not a panacea, but I mean, I think you have an ally on the other side of the counter there that probably wasn't really so much there 10 or 15 years ago. I think that's a positive. Yes, ma'am.
You're using the word zoning a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm getting the impression that you're going to think in terms of creating a bunch of kinds of zones that we don't have right now. But my understanding is that there are only a certain number of kinds of zones that you are allowed to have.
Oh no, no.
So,
there's no limit to the kinds of zones you're allowed to have. We're not trying to see how complicated we can make it either. We're looking for right now we're just asking the question of, are there some things about the existing zoning that it would be good to adjust? And then as a separate matter would be the question of how.
well, I think it would be helpful for you to tell us what kind of zones we currently have, because I think there's just a few right now that we currently have. So are you saying that it's possible to take a zone which is, let's just pick R1 for instance, would you be recommending creating subsets of R1
Probably.
to meet the...
I mean, that's what we usually do.
Okay.
But we don't, it's up to you all. It's up to you all, but it's just our observation. R1 means you've got one house on one lot, and it's not touching the neighbor's house. So that can be anything from a 2-story house on a 35-foot wide lot in the middle of town to a 15,000 square foot house on an 8-acre lot. So we're thinking that different rules might want, the same rules are unlikely to make you a really nice little cottage in the middle of town and an estate with 3 barns on 8 acres. So I'm using the extremes, but we're thinking that houses in one part of town, the nicest houses, or the houses that look the most like they belong in one part of town, are probably different in some subtle ways from the houses in another part of town. That's what we're hearing. That's why the City Council and Planning Commission asked us to talk to you folks about these things, because they were perceiving that there were some differences that the community hoped for that aren't being currently expressed in the zoning. We don't want to focus too much on the details of zoning today. The question simply is, what do you think what are the characteristics of each of these parts of town that you guys think are the most important? Then we'll go back and compare those to what your zoning is telling people now, and we'll come back at the next presentation and tell you which areas it looks like what you want. The good news is your zoning is already saying, yeah, do that. And which areas there might be something that's out of whack.
Well, the reason that I'm asking this question is because it goes back to the divide between quirky and enforced. Mm-hmm. And if it's zoned a certain way, then it becomes enforced. Whereas if you say, let's divide this town up into neighborhoods, mm-hmm. and let's give a description of the characteristics mm-hmm. of this neighborhood
right.
that we would like to retain.
Yes.
So that when the council approves something in a neighborhood, or the mm-hmm. Planning Commission approves something in a neighborhood, they have a written guideline that says the character of this neighborhood, yes. which we'd like to protect, is as follows.
Yeah. It could be that simple.
See, what we've had for as long as I've been here is every document in town, the general plan, everything, talks about Ojai's, quote, small town character.
Right.
We write about it, we talk about it. Nobody knows what it means.
Correct. That's why we're here. That's why we're here. And every general plan, I kid you not, every general plan, including probably Irvine's, starts with saying that the top priority is to preserve and enhance the existing small town character. And then everybody adopts the same zoning ordinance as everybody. I mean, have you ever wondered why every city looks like every other city? It's because they all say in their general plan they want to preserve and enhance their existing small town character, and then they adopt Pacoima's zoning code. Yes, ma'am. So you can keep your zoning code, and we can flesh out what your general plan meant when it said preserve and enhance your existing small village character, or we can sort of look one neighborhood at a time and try to figure out what you meant when you said that, because it probably wasn't one thing for every part of town. But if it was, that's easier.
Well, when I see the Planning Commission going into angst over what they're going to do
right.
with the walls on
right.
Signal Street
exactly.
above Grand,
right.
I think it would be really nice if there was some kind of a narrative
yep.
that said on Signal Street above Grand, we're trying to preserve this kind of a look.
There you go. Well, at a minimum, we're going to do that.
Yeah.
That's going to come out of this process. And then you can decide if you want to do anything to your zoning or just leave it like it is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Oh.
Yeah, actually, kid, ma'am. Oh, one more thing. Juan has a very good suggestion. Based on the way that the conversation's going, I think probably having us go into this next set of slides where we're actually talking about each of these areas one at a time in a little more detail would probably be a good idea. And I think a lot of these questions are probably related to what we're going to go through here. And again, this presentation is not answers, it's questions.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say
Yes, please.
is myself as a council member, one of the
Yep.
things that motivated me to encourage this whole process was not so much to restrict people more, but realizing that our current zoning was actually restricting people.
Right.
Particularly in the downtown where we have 50-foot wide lots and we were applying Southern California developers setbacks to these properties, and we were actually restricting people even more. So I think a lot of my motivation around the neighborhood planning was to actually take away the yoke of a lot of this,
right,
and enable people to be more creative on their property, right, where the current zoning is not allowing that. And I think that's really important, that it's not an attempt to restrict people more. In my opinion, as an individual council member, we're trying to help define the community better so that we don't restrict people more, that we make it a more creative process, and that we do, because we did not evolve, we were not like this cookie cutter community that was created like Irvine. We're going to make a community, and the developers came in and they put in the grid, and here are the houses, and this is the way it's done. This is an evolutionary town. It started with carriage roads, so our roads are narrow. You know, it started with wide, deep lots so the chickens and the hog could be in the back.
Absolutely.
And so it was an organic development. And I think what we've done is we've applied inorganic development standards to an organic community.
Very
and that's what I'm hoping comes out of this, is to take that huge onus of those ridiculous restrictions being applied to a community where it isn't appropriate.
That's a very, very good insight. But it turns out most California towns and cities that people love the most, that go to on vacation and spend a lot of money, were built before there was zoning.
I have one last comment. In the road.
I'm sorry?
Anywhere in the road, the habitats that are diverse,
right,
are attractive.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And they're attractive and they're fragile.
Yes.
So that's the reason to still have zoning. The reason to still have zoning is so that somebody doesn't come in with, to follow your analogy, with some escaped exotic species that, you know, it shows up like a weed in the middle of your beautiful downtown. So the zoning needs to rule out things that just should not be there, but it needs to allow the economy and the creativity of the town to continue to work on, you know, making it become something even better. Yes, sir.
I have one last comment. I enjoyed William's comment about how we're going to integrate the county with the city. And my observation here is there's no one from the school board, and I was just wondering how we're going to integrate our schools into this general plan. So, county, schools, city, we're all a big part of this vision and big picture.
Absolutely. So any comments, either now as we talk, follow-up comments in the form of like a written response, an email, something you want to drop off to the planning department with suggestions along those lines is absolutely everything's in. And I wish, based on your comment, we had gone a little bit less technical and just put, you know, vision for Ojai up the top, because that's what this is for. Shall we go on to the more detailed, well, not a lot more detailed. So, oh yeah, some of the fonts on your computer are different than ours, so we have a few words going off the bottom of the page. But, so, the main, so this first phase of work, everything is fair game for discussion. But the work product that we're going to deliver at the end of this work is going to be essentially a vision plan, as we have been talking about, that defines the character and scale and quality and what's most important in the different parts of Ojai. And we're going to deliver some very specific guidelines for the frontages, so that as the Planning Commission and Council over the next year or two, or assuming at some point you fine-tune your zoning, but maybe that's a couple of years from now, we don't know. That's a funding-driven thing. But in between now and whenever you changed your zoning in some ways, you would have a set of guidelines about how the frontages are designed, how tall walls should be on, as you were saying, how tall walls should be on or shouldn't be on certain streets. Should they be set back a little bit behind the sidewalk so there's some planting between the base of the wall and the sidewalk, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, where are open fences? Probably the best thing, maybe out on Gridley, are better than solid walls. Don't know. But so we're gonna deliver some guidelines that you can use to help you make decisions about how the fronts of property are made more private or less private, and what's the design quality difference along Grand Avenue, for instance, versus Ojai Avenue versus neighborhood streets. Oh, please.
I know. There's certain things you
Oh.
can capture with an image. It would
Yes.
be so good said.
Oh, please. Now, do we have the capability of those being uploaded to the website, or that probably just ought to be email attachments? Would that be the best, Kathy? Email information and pictures. Should they take your email address, or should we give them our email address?
I think we can take mine and
Okay.
and then we can work together.
Okay.
That was one of the other things I was going to bring up is that, you know, some people in an open forum like this, some people don't feel comfortable speaking.
Yeah.
You know? And
Right.
so rest assured, if you're not feeling comfortable speaking out in this kind of forum, be sure to email me. I'll forward it to Dave.
Mhm.
We want as much feedback as we can possibly get. You don't have, you know, you can wait to the end of this whole presentation and still email us. And when you go home today, when you're sitting there driving the car and you think of something, then email me. So, you know, everybody should know my name by now. My last name is, our email, so it's my last name is WOLD, so it's Wold at ci.ojai.ca.us. Okay, that's the website for Ojai. So I'd be happy to take them, and then we'll try to work out something with IT to start on the webpage and put all the comments and the, you know, kind of a dialogue page and anything
Okay.
that you want to
Yeah, yeah, that would be fantastic. So, and that way we can capture images that you want to give to us.
Because I already think of a lot of
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're collectors of pictures. We have hundreds already, and we thousands are good. So a lot of this work is going to be focused on frontages. But the elements, what defines the character of neighborhoods in general, we're just going to show you a few pictures, some of which are Ojai, some of them aren't, just to get people thinking in terms of sort of the kit of parts that make a town. And some of that kit of parts is shaped by zoning, and some aspects of those are maybe better shaped by guidelines or just a vision with policy. So building the size and scale of the buildings, whether it's sort of a small town village scale, a small downtown scale, that's Ventura, maybe in some cases you've got a building that's 3 stories, but with frontages that are unified, like with an arcade. Then you've got, we think of these. We sometimes simplify it into 2 kinds of buildings. One we call block form, meaning it's sort of the edge of a downtown block. It's part of a perimeter block building, and they're just, each building is a piece of the block, like with your arcade. And this one, and that's certainly a middle of town sort of thing. That in Ojai, it's not a very big area of town, but it's an important area of town. And then there's house form buildings, which sometimes they're just houses, sometimes they're multiple family dwellings, but with sort of a house-like form and scale. And in town, they're probably set closer to the street. In the neighborhoods, they're set farther back. In the rural environment, sometimes they're really set very far back. So this is a house form building. This is a building that's about the same size, but it's a block form building that comes right up to and embraces the street. Then there's sort of buildings in between, in scale, like, well, your hotel downtown is of this kind of a scale where it has the massing. If this building was just a wall that went all the way from there to there, it would be a very different thing from a building that's massed into pieces. Each piece has sort of the scale of a little downtown building or a house. So that's the kind of thing, and we're not saying that you should have we're not saying there's lots of parts of town in Ojai that you should have buildings this big. Most of Ojai is just houses. But where you do get larger buildings, whether through zoning or whether through guidelines or whether just through the design review process, you need to make sure that the scale of the pieces is sort of a town scale, so you don't get what we sometimes refer to as like an ocean liner in a dinghy harbor, where you get, it's like, the whole harbor is full of small boats, and then this cruise ship comes in, and that's usually not welcome. This building's about the same size, but it's of a very different character because it's set back. The frontage here is a garden with a low wall, but the character of the fence and the character of the building are similar. If this was a concrete block wall, it wouldn't probably be very nice. If it were 2 feet taller, it would be completely different. And then in single-family development, you've got, a lot of single-family neighborhoods have like a front lawn. Well, this is what we would usually call a dooryard. It's a very lovely thing in a lot of places. So a question would be, in some neighborhoods, do you want to just allow complete flexibility on whether somebody has this or a lawn, or are there some blocks that already have an established pattern where, almost everybody has this sort of thing, or everybody currently has a lawn, and it would be odd if they did this. We're not saying that you need to regulate things, we're just asking the question, helping you think about it. And in this case, this is multifamily, but again, the scale is softened and very much downscaled by the way the building, it's an apartment complex, but it's designed as a series of smaller buildings with a garden. It changes the character a lot. So all of these things are possible. In this case, that's a downtown building, but it's built right to the street, but it has a very small town sort of village scale to it by the way it's designed. And then here, this is this Ventura. It's taller buildings, but no building is wider than 50 or 60 feet. So the fact, in this case, the articulation, people talk a lot about breaking up the mass. Well, there's a lot of ways to do that. In this kind of a setting, you're not doing that with pushing the face of the building back and forth. You're not putting a garden in front of one of them. What happened, the way this scale has broken up the mass is, basically it's how the place was platted in the first place. But, the buildings change height. The profile is varied and the architecture is varied so that it's clearly a bunch of smallish buildings in a small town, not a big city downtown. And then even when you get into you have not very big, but, your light industrial area, there's a lot of different ways that buildings can have a design character. In this case, it's built right up to the street, and the parking is behind in a lot, as opposed to just a parking lot in the front. And that may not be something that's important to differentiate, but just to think about how there are choices. And some of them are important enough you might want to regulate them, and some of them you might want to just give people suggestions. So the existing character areas, you've got the downtown, obviously. You've got this is just how we've seen it so far, and we're interested to hear if you think we're seeing it about right. You've got these rural gateways areas where you're still in the rural environment, but you're approaching town. You've got what we're calling sort of suburban entries, where you've got the buildings have been built more by suburban development standards, so you've got more parking lots in front, etc. You've got the in-town neighborhoods, sort of the early neighborhoods that are right next to the downtown, both to the north and the south, and we think those have some unique characteristics. You've got the Arbolada, which is pretty much the Arbolada. And we actually, over the last few years, have gone through a long process developing design guidelines, and it's not easy, for a place very much like the Arbolada, actually in Kansas. A neighborhood, a very beautiful neighborhood that was built at the same time originally. And so there's ways of either with guidelines or with with policies, there's ways of describing what's most important to preserve in a place like that without doing standards that start making anything cookie cutter. You've got sort of the more suburban neighborhood development that, and all of this is basically a timeline. You know, the oldest stuff that's of one particular character was in the middle, and then as expanded out, each area reflected at the time in which it was built and the prevailing development practices and standards that were in effect at that time. And we're not suggesting that you should try to go back and erase time. It's just going to be a series of questions. Then you've got these we're calling, and these names can be anything, but we're just trying to make them descriptive now. We're calling these neighborhood edge because those are generally the semi-rural character. It's not just cookie cutter suburban stuff. It's not old in-town neighborhoods. It's not Gridley Road. It's something in between. A lot of different things in between. Then you've got some rural area at the edges. You've got your little light industrial area there. And then you've got the civic areas, mainly the golf courses and the country clubs and the schools. So we're going to just you also have already adopted a map of neighborhoods that we understand was done mostly, or one of the main reasons the map of neighborhoods was done was to inform a street tree master plan, to figure out which areas had which kinds of trees. And that's this map. And we're not suggesting that we go to a bubble diagram. That was just a quick way to put it on the screen. But we think there's, and what you have on the table is sort of our first shot of maybe thinking about merging this kind of a real simplistic bubble diagram with the existing little map of neighborhood areas, because we don't think that each of these we don't think that each of these little areas is an area that needs its own standards in any way. And we think that, but what we want you to help us think about is which of these areas have enough basic design characteristics in common that it's useful to think about it as an area with a certain sort of a character, with a certain sort of a flavor that would inform both how the streets are made and how the building development happens. So in the rural gateway areas here, the land uses are mostly very low intensity residential and public open space and vacant land. Everything's 1 and 2 stories. A lot of the lots are very big. The frontages are mostly natural, and any buildings are set way back. There's no sidewalks because it's not town yet. And parking, if any, is just sort of you pull off on the shoulder of the road. And these are some examples of those kinds of environments. It's basically just the edge of town countryside stuff. Then as you come into these into town but not yet in the middle of town gateways, you've got mostly a mix of retail, office, and institutional, like the schools. Mostly, again, 1 and 2 stories, mostly larger lots. Most of the buildings are set back a ways, either behind yards or behind parking lots. Sidewalks tend to be on at least one side of the street, and we're hearing that both might be a good idea. And parking is typically not provided on the street, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is something we can talk about. And the parking lots tend to be in front or behind the building, so it's a lot of different things, and so it's a bit, well, it's clearly a bit of a jumble right now, and we're not anti-jumble. We just are asking, are there things that you would do to make this a more sort of unified character, or is it just fine? Because, you know, if it ain't broke, we do not want to fix it. This is just on the just on the west approach into town. Thank you, Paul. And you know, so there's a sidewalk over here. This isn't a good walking environment, and this, so there's a bunch of questions. You know, should this be a good walking environment? And if it should, there's probably ways to do a significantly better walking environment there without putting sidewalks in everywhere, or maybe sidewalks are a good idea, and if so, maybe there's a special kind that would work there instead of just putting in the usual thing. So that, and on both sides of downtown, but when you go around the curve heading west, you get into this sort of mixed situation. And when you're going east, and you get like a block past the arcade, again, you're into sort of a mixed situation. It's like, well, what is this? So the question is, you know, what do these stretches of Ojai Avenue want to be when they grow up? And the transportation guys have been thinking about that a bunch. Well, Steve, do you want to say a couple words about the ideas that came out of that workshop you had before?
Right now or later?
Well, now.
Just putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, it is. Yeah,
Where's the mic?
About Ojai Avenue.
Juan, do you have a microphone?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry.
Good.
Ojai Avenue. Sure.
Yeah, and not specifically this place, but just in general, just sort of the top 3 or 4 things that you heard about Ojai Avenue and some of the things we're looking at.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this briefly toward the end of the meeting when I have a few slides of my own to present, but
yeah.
I think there were a couple of sort of basic principles. One was we were looking to, you know, improve conditions for all the users of the street and not just think of streets as a place to move cars, but also a place for people to walk, a place for people on bikes. We've heard, you know, there are a lot of avid cyclists in this community, so we heard a lot about that. The other thing is, you know, a focus on safety. Safety is always job one for us. It always comes first. And, you know, I think the other thing is just, you know, Dave spent a lot of time when we're talking about, you know, sort of not taking a one-size-fits-all approach, you know, really sort of tailoring our recommendations to the context and the community's kind of unique desires for that location. And it's the same thing with transportation as it is with land use. And so I think we have, you know, on Ojai Avenue in particular, you know, in the downtown area, there was a lot of focus on looking at pedestrians, you know, crossing the street. We heard a lot about, you know, people crossing the street, and sometimes it's hard to see them if you're in a car, and it's not necessarily the safest condition. A little further out, you know, it's sort of those gateway entries. There's actually a lot of road space that's not being used by cars. It's not really being used by anyone. Right. That we thought might be an opportunity to provide some bike lanes, or, you know, maybe even widen sidewalks. There are some different things that you could do in different places. Right. And then there were a couple of key intersections along Ojai Avenue. I think the Y intersection in particular we heard a lot about. Heard a lot of different ideas. We have some ideas of our own for how you might make that a more attractive entryway to the community and also safer for everyone. So we'll talk about more about this later. But
thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. But this slide sort of captures the where you might want to do some interventions. Yes, ma'am. Go.
One of the things that we struggle with in the city is that Ojai Avenue is Caltrans.
Yep.
So we have a minimal amount of control of what goes on there, including speed limits.
Yeah.
And one thing I was recently told was the mob shop, part of their development requirement was that they had to plant street trees. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the requirement we had for them to plant street trees, Caltrans is telling them they can't.
Right.
So how do you plan to help integrate the problem we have with Caltrans, speed limits, traffic control, and adding street trees to our whole...
That's one of the main reasons we have these guys on the team, because they understand towns and they understand Caltrans, and that's always a problem. But like I mentioned about the county, that they're a kinder, gentler, smarter group than 20 years ago. The same is true of Caltrans. They're trying to they're trying to create ways to recognize that a highway in the middle of a town and a highway out in the orchards doesn't necessarily have to be the same form. Because I mean, there's a long history of Caltrans, ripping through the middles of cities and tearing them up, and they're trying to do better. So there's hope, and we'll be talking to them. So let's keep going. So we have time for you folks to talk, and the interjecting here is great as well. So the downtown. I mean, I don't need to tell you a lot about what downtown is, but again, it's 1- and 2-story buildings. The buildings are up close to the street with shop fronts for the most part, sidewalks on both sides of the street. If there's trees, they're between the curb and the person. And the parking is both on street and behind the buildings. It's, downtown. And your zoning already reflects that, and there may be some ways in which it could be adjusted to be more complete. And we're going to illustrate some of the possibilities for how a combination of street improvements and infill buildings on key sites might make the downtown feel, it might extend. We're going to suggest ways that if you're interested, that the sort of the downtown character and quality could extend a little farther to the west and to the east into some of those sort of ragged areas. Anyway, downtown is fantastic. That's why you got so many tourists. One of the reasons you got so many tourists. The in-town neighborhoods, again, they're mostly 1-story. There's some 2-story buildings. The zoning allows 2 stories. And then if they're going to be 2 stories, they need to be 2 stories, the right kind of 2 stories. Well, what's that? Well, that's something we're going to be talking about. They all have front yards. Most of them have low fences and walls. Not a lot of sidewalks. And as long as the cars are going pretty slow, you don't have to have sidewalks everywhere. There's a lot of neighborhoods that are okay without sidewalks, but then you got to do things to get the cars to behave in terms of speed. So that's another thing. That's another important thing these guys are looking at is it's called traffic calming. That's me. Sorry. Which is ways ways of adjusting the way the streets are designed or the intersections, tightening things up. Because as soon as a street looks like you shouldn't be driving fast, most people slow down. Drivers aren't dummies for the most, if they're over 17 especially. And will tend to behave themselves. So the in-town neighborhoods have lots of these beautiful frontages. The houses aren't set back very far, but the character and quality of the landscaping between the street and the houses is generally quite high. And then the suburban neighborhoods, again, it's mostly 1-story, some 2-story. The zoning allows 2-story. Again, 2-story, you need to be more, the taller the building gets, the more careful you need to be that it doesn't have negative impacts on what's around it. They have front yards. Most of the garages face the street, and most of them have the 2-car wide driveway where people often park in front. Sidewalks on both sides of the streets, in a lot of cases, some cases one side. So just sort of regular. Now, some of them, in some of the areas, the street network is, the blocks tend to be bigger, which makes it a little harder to walk around the neighborhood. The blocks in the middle of town are smaller blocks, which makes walking hither and thither more convenient and more comfortable, because if you live here and you're going to visit this person, you've got sort of a long hike. But it's the sort of interconnected network like the original part of Ojai. Then there's some other parts that were built under the more suburban regulations where you've got a bunch of cul-de-sacs and dead-end streets where, again, it's even harder to walk because if you live here and you want to go visit your friend here, you've got to, you've got to hike. And basically, these kinds of neighborhoods were built based on the assumption, and it turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that every time you leave the house, it's in your car. And sure enough, that's what happens. It makes it real easy for the traffic engineers to count the cars because they know that every time you leave the house, that's a car trip. Whereas if in town, you can't calculate it. Yes.
One other element I wanted to mention is street views,
Yes.
which become really evident in these neighborhoods and suburban neighborhoods.
Yep.
Because they all seem to come in 1950s style based on somehow being oriented to the car.
Well.
And if you go from your original comment about integration of nature and housing in the Arbolada to this extreme, where we have those I find them very offensive, non-dark sky friendly streetlights.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of see that in the neighborhoods in between, we have some of those same intrusive streetlights. That seems to be an issue that we should address within this vision.
Cool. Good. Very good observation. Again, it was the standards of the time, and everybody was nobody was trying to do a bad thing. The good engineers that brought you this neighborhood were wanting to design the neighborhood so you wouldn't have cut-through traffic, and they were trying to design the lighting so that at night it would be safe. They weren't thinking about neighborhood character. Those kinds of neighborhoods were built when the people who laid them out were just given incomplete instruction sets. They said, well, make sure the traffic moves okay, make sure the water all runs generally toward the ocean, and make sure that it's light enough. And they did that. But nobody told them, make sure that it has the look and feel of Ojai. Nobody told them, make sure it's comfortable for the kids to walk to school safely. Nobody told them that bikes were important. If they had, they would have done it differently. So a lot of what this is about is just providing a complete instruction set for what's important. And the streets are simple, and some of them have more landscaping, some of them have less. The sidewalks are narrow, but they're there. The streets are a little wider than they probably need to be to carry the traffic, but would it be worth coming back and rebuilding the curbs in another place? Probably not. In some places you've got houses facing the street, in other places you've got walls facing the street because of the way they laid those out and the positions they put fences. So that's just the normal suburban neighborhood stuff that was built mostly in the 50s and 60s and some in the 70s. Then you've got what we're calling the neighborhood edge. Again, it's mostly one story. It's mostly houses. The lots are bigger. And in a lot of cases, most of them do not. A lot of them do not have sidewalks. So what gives this kind of a street its much more rural character is the fact that there aren't sidewalks and the fact that there are pretty organized, not regimented, but regular plantings of oaks near the street so that it gives you this sort of enclosed, leafy, quiet neighborhood street feel. And Paul could tell you more about this, but people in general, people on a street like this just sort of naturally drive faster than they do on a street like that. People just sort of ease their foot up on the gas in general. There's nothing about that street. I mean, it's straight, It's wide enough. There's nothing about that street that would like prevent you from speeding, but in general, people do not. And then out on this neighborhood edge, again, the lots are significantly bigger in some cases. The streets have been laid out to sort of follow the contours. That's very much the case in Arbolada. But it's more picturesque because you've got more landscape around you. And then in some cases, the lots get very big. And then you've got the Arbolada, which is they carefully threaded the streets around through the trees, following the contours, and laid them out so that as you're coming down a curved street, you're seeing the landscape in front of you all the time. And when you come to an intersection, you're often looking at something interesting across the intersection. People tend to drive very slowly in that kind of, and where the streets are even narrower. They realize that, by the way, if you're not parking on the street anyway, which you're not when you get into lots this big, your visitors tend to just come up and park on your property. Then you don't need the street to be way wide, and you don't need the street to have curbs on it, because the water can just run down here into a ditch or a rill. And so that gives you a whole different kind of an environment. And any regulations that are in place for building homes in this kind of an environment just really need to be different than they are in town. Because look, if somebody came and built a house, 12 feet off the edge of the road, I think most people in town would come unglued. Certainly, so it's just a different. The zoning in a lot of ways is like a recipe, and the difference between angel food cake and bread, they're both mostly flour, but they're very different, and that's because the recipe and some of the ingredients are different. And you just got to know which one you're making. And a lot of this beautiful rural detailing, the curb made of cobbles, and the natural and native and adaptive landscape is the strongest single characteristic. And then the rural, it's basically the same thing, only the lots just get bigger. And there's no sidewalks, and the streets really sort of move with the terrain. And then in the light industrial, it's almost all 1 story, 2 stories possible. This isn't really, obviously not a neighborhood, it's a separate thing. You've mostly got, in some cases you've got no sidewalks, which in a place like this was probably just fine.
Hold on.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I have a project currently happening right now.
Yes.
Just south from the Mayflower truck.
Yes. Now I don't have my compass on. Is it next door or across the side? Oh, this way. Yes.
On the left-hand side of the street there, we're developing a project and compelled by the city to install sidewalk. And so we're going to have the only sidewalk for a quarter mile on that street.
Yeah.
And I guarantee in my lifetime, the Mayflower property, and there's about 4 others on the street, their kids are younger than I, and they will never trigger any kind of a permit to put in a sidewalk on that street. So the issue that I have, I don't disagree with putting in a sidewalk. I think it's a good thing.
Yes.
There's 2 gyms, there's a dance studio, the Wheel Tennis Academy, a racket club, and many other things on Bryant Street, the Humane Society. People constantly walking up and down the street or riding their bikes. The sidewalk is a great idea.
Yes.
My question is it possible to do something with the city to, outside of somebody triggering a permit, to put in the sidewalk on the entire run of the street now, so people don't walk off of my sidewalk back into the dirt and the bushes?
That's another, thank you, that's perfect. That's another reason to have this kind of a community conversation where you're all talking about how you want stuff to turn out. Because the answer is certainly yes. That has almost nothing to do with zoning. That has to do with the city's infrastructure development plan. And every city has a traffic capacity development policy. Most cities have policies that require that that the level of service of traffic be level of service C. Basically, there's a policy priority is making sure traffic never has to slow down, which has a lot of negative consequences actually, because then it speeds up and maybe you didn't want that. But the point is that a city can have policies and infrastructure, long-term infrastructure improvement plans based on a lot of things. So we're working on the early phases of a bicycle plan for the city, which would then be agreed upon so that anytime you were doing enhancements to a street, you would know that you either did or didn't need to put a bicycle lane in. Same thing here, that it wouldn't just be triggered by one project, but there would be a decision that the city wants to have sidewalks alongside one side of that street, and then there would need to be a funding mechanism or an implementation mechanism put in place. Because right now, if developers are charged a traffic impact fee, so they have to, put in a new traffic signal somewhere or widen a street somewhere. Well, it doesn't just have to be about traffic capacity. It can be about pedestrian safety and bicycle safety and property value, etc. So all of those factors can be included in the city's transportation policy and transportation master plan, so that adding a sidewalk here is as important as adding a left turn lane somewhere, so that you don't have to wait at rush hour.
Two more glaring examples as well. Since I've been here for 50 years, since I've been a kid riding and walking around town, there's 3 hotels in the East End out here.
Yep.
And there's a vacant lot where it's been dirt and mud since I was a kid, that the people have to tromp through the mud or the dirt to get to town. Nothing's going to happen unless that property is developed. I don't see that happening for a long time. Is there any way we could pave that so people don't have to walk through the dirt? And also, there's a stretch of asphalt between the Valero gas station and the art shop. It's horrible. It was horrible when I was a kid. That's a vacant lot again. Nobody's going to do anything unless that lot is developed. Is there a way we can fix that before
of course
those get developed?
Sure.
It's in the middle of town.
Right. So it basically requires more or less 2 things. One is the community deciding that that's important, and then 2 is figuring out a way to pay for it. So yeah, the first step is figuring out that that's important, and that may or may not be anywhere in a city document saying that that's a priority. Because usually most cities have a policy that the front of a property gets fixed whenever somebody develops something. And in a town where there's been enough opposition to developing something, as there has been in Ojai, then it's like pick one. If you want that built, then let somebody develop it. And if you don't want them to develop it, then maybe you figure out another way to get that built.
Well, let me give you 2 examples. There's one on Grandview up here,
Yeah.
where the school, they had no sidewalk going on Grandview. So they just put it in.
Yep.
I think they got grant funding or
There you go.
somebody.
There's more and more of
Another
that.
example is El Roblar and Miners Oaks.
Yes.
They didn't wait until everybody pulled a permit.
Right,
They put in
right.
a stretch of sidewalk in front of their building.
Absolutely.
They put the entire sidewalk in at once. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So you feel strongly about that, huh? I'm just teasing you.
I feel
Yeah.
strongly about, on my project,
Yeah.
I'm going to have the only sidewalk
I know.
on that street.
I get it completely. Yes. Yeah. No, it's figuring out how you want the whole thing to turn out, and which of those sorts of public amenities are a priority is terribly important, and you can't do that on a project-by-project basis. The only way you can do that is like here.
And another example, I live on Grand Avenue next to the Gables, a couple houses away. They probably spent in the last few years, $3 million? They have one of the few stretches, my house included, with no sidewalk on the north side of the street, not required to put a sidewalk in.
Okay. Yes, sir.
As much as Chet Hilger's lauds the new installation of sidewalk, and I agree with all your examples. I'd like to see sidewalk removed in some places. The city has capriciously put sidewalk on Grand Avenue where there's no other sidewalk in sight. And why do we have that there? And I think what I would like to really say in this regard is the city should not be compelled to put in sidewalk without a plan for it, just to do it. Just because somebody wants to add a room or improve their property, they're all of a sudden required, like you said, on Bryant Street to put in sidewalk, and this is silly. So the purpose we're here is to come up for the kind of general agreement on where we want certain features in the city, and I would really like to see us get together on the sidewalk thing, like more here, less there.
Ta-da, that's why we're here. Because as long as you have one rule that applies everywhere, so again, it's this one-size-fits-all thing. If the rule is you develop your property, you build a sidewalk in front, then some places that's a good thing, and some places it's not. Yeah, Juan, we need a mic over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, of course. Excuse me, I didn't see.
I thought we were going to do our little groups, and
yes,
we are. Okay.
We're pretty much done with this. People just keep asking questions, and that's fine with me. But
okay, then I just wanted to say about the bike path, which is awesome, going all the way from Soul Park to where does it go? All the way to the beach. But the cars stop for the people, and the people, the walkers, walk right out into the street. Maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe the cars should have the stop signs, and the people should just, because it's pretty dangerous the way that it is.
Thank you. We've got like one more slide here, and then we're going to be into the small groups.
And I just wanted to interject something real quickly about the sidewalks and the mandate coming from the city to put in the sidewalks with development. Is that the city, we need to understand that the city planners, our hands are tied by past practices, and if they're required by the current existing zoning laws to require that of development, their hands are tied and they're having to require it. And there are ways to deal with that, to defer putting in the sidewalk, number one, but number two, that's why we're here, is to say this isn't appropriate and we need to untie the hands of the planner and not put them in the position of forcing people to have to do this. So I think it's really important to understand that we need to not necessarily vilify or criticize the planning department or the city for requiring certain things, because our policies are tying their hands too. And that's again why we're here, is to try to untie these hands from our city staff as well as our citizens, so that we can protect our small town character.
Sure. Well, that's why those big streetlights are there.
That was the theme at the beginning that we were saying that. So
yeah.
Quite well on all these details. Let's move on the principle.
Yeah. Good. So the last pieces are just the civic spaces, which they don't have zoning. They're not really affected by zoning. There's an existing map of community structure which shows in a very simple way. You've got downtown, you've got the older neighborhoods, and then everything else is just sort of neighborhoods. So we're in the process of refining that with your help. Oh, by the way, here's the existing zoning. And we're not talking about getting rid of it. We're talking about hearing what you all have to say and then thinking about whether there's things that might want to be adjusted to better reflect the community's wishes. And that's the existing neighborhood map again. Anyway, so we are to the, we'll skip back then. So among the questions are these general areas that we colored differently here. Do those make any sense to you in terms of what's similar and what's not? And what do you think about the questions we've asked about which areas would want to be preserved carefully? Which areas do you think some change over time could make them better in terms of the way the streets are made, in terms of the way the frontages are developed, in terms of the ways that buildings are developed?
Yeah, one of the things that we haven't talked about, which is evident in this community, is it's a destination community.
Yes.
No matter how we establish Ojai as a city, it's constantly in flux with the changes, and there's more and more events going on.
Yep.
There's more and more people coming to town.
Yes.
So the issue of parking hasn't been
Yes,
talked about.
right.
The issue of moving people, stopping people, although we've been talking about crosswalks.
Mhm.
But is that going to be brought up too? I suppose I'm bringing it up now.
You're bringing it up now, and sure that yes, when we're going to show you some ideas about how the downtown could be extended perhaps a bit to the east and the west in terms of a more cohesive character about making the whole center of town nicer to walk and bike, and parking is certainly a big issue there. And I think probably what you're going to have to do is start to more actively manage how parking is used. There's two ways to solve parking problems. One is to add a lot more parking spaces. I don't know, anybody want a parking structure behind the arcade? Probably not. So then there's ways of, as you say, there's ways of managing who parks where, or having some remote lots that people can be brought in with shuttles, or scheduling events. The management functions. We're not really talking about that kind of management stuff now, but we certainly can a bit. Yes, Steve.
Integrate the complete streets workshops that we've been doing, and I'm assuming, Steve, you're going to, because I think that will help explain to us as citizens in this community that there's a correlation, there's a strong correlation between complete streets and neighborhood planning.
Yes.
And when you're talking about pedestrian circulation, traffic circulation, parking, all those things are really pointed and focused to complete streets and how that correlates and integrates with neighborhood planning. So in a sense, you have one issue, but it's subdivided into two.
Correct.
So I'm hoping that for our sake that comes out clearly today, the distinction and how that comes together.
Yes. Good. Well, why don't you talk among your smaller groups about what you think's most important or right or wrong about what we've been talking about so far, and then after that we'll ask each one of your tables to give us back like a couple-minute summary of what you folks think. Hi.
Hi, my name's Betsy.
I'm David.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh,
I've
sure.
really been looking forward to this.
Oh, good. Oh, nice. Yes.
Yeah, and
Thank
I'm also in school at USC studying gerontology.
Oh,
A
cool.
lot about elder-friendly communities and you know, the next generation of suburbs.
Yep. Well, that's what we've been working on for 20, 30 years.
I love it. I love it. And I want a sidewalk in front of the gable.
Okay, thank you.
It's right here.
I don't really think it's possible.
I don't, because it's, all it is just dead end.
Yeah.
So
I don't see any
you want
reason.
me to- you want me to stop?
I think that makes sense. You could check with Kathy, but yeah, let's double check with.
You alluded before to an overnight success. I guess we have to add another night to it.
Yeah.
But one thought that I have, once the citizenry agrees on a certain neighborhoods, wouldn't it be possible to get in the neighborhood some cohesion and input from them?
I would think so. We can ask. The city has been doing the public outreach, but I think if we can identify, I see no reason that we could do more targeted noticing to specific neighborhoods, and we could have, so maybe at the next workshop, and we've actually thought about this before, we're just wanting to see what comes out of this to inform how we'd best do the next step, but we've been, one of the possibilities we've been thinking about would be to have the next work.
Very brilliant what you have done.
Oh, thank you.
And I think it speaks to a lot of people.
Good.
We have to get the message out.
I agree.
That's what it is.
And
don't get bogged down on sidewalks and whatnot.
I know.
It's make a political speech.
Yeah, I know. You gotta, but that always happens. You just gotta, you just. Sort of the top 10 or 5 most important things are? Oh, I'm sorry. Here, let me. No, here, let me turn it on. All right.
Maybe it was on.
No, there's 2 on switches and they.
So our table came up with, I think the most, well, first of all, we looked at, are the rough boundaries of these character areas about right? And we would say yes. I think we had one comment regarding
VMU.
The VMU and residential and how we might be able to clarify that.
We got that.
So that there's no, so there's a clear boundary there
Between commercial and residential.
between commercial and residential.
And, and that's no surprise, that's right in the middle of town where that's always trickiest. So we know that. Thank you.
So that was that actually plays into number 2. Are there any missing character areas? And then I think the most important thing that we came to as a group is changing the community mindset from cars first to people first.
Yep.
So that was, we think that was the most important thing. And then strengthening neighborhoods, creating flow for pedestrians, bicycle, horses, and notice how we left out cars, because we already have a community that's driven by car flow, not people flow. We thought one of the better comments, one of our group's best comments was actually revisiting the historical data on how our community was developed from pre-Libby, Libby, post-Libby.
Yep.
And we think that might help us to have a better historical understanding of our community. And I think the last thing I wrote down was any zoning or any ordinance which we either recreate or modify in the existing, that we make it so that it's enforceable.
Yep.
not creating zones or creating gray areas in zoning. We just know that it has to be able to be enforced. I think that was it.
Cool. How about your table? Who's gonna? And you can speak for.
Okay, so our group started off with not so much the neighborhood in neighborhoods that are defined as much as looking at the corridors, the traffic corridors, and we think that they're lacking in the proposed maps in that. I think the gentleman over there has a good outline of it, which is Ojai is probably the most recognized from the people that come from the outside of the area, but there are cut-throughs and traditional patterns of driving that the locals use, and they need to be identified in any kind of neighborhood defining for Ojai, because what ends up happening is it's identified that in order to keep things residential and some things commercial, you need to not be using these cut-throughs and taking residential streets and making them collectors. So you need to really identify why people are cutting through neighborhoods and making them more, the traffic, a higher rate, more volume, and really look at where lights need to be and why, how we get people really, using the streets for the purpose they're supposed to be. And one of the overarching things should be when we're creating these neighborhoods is some things need to be universal for Ojai, and they need to be that the trails and how the trail needs to be comprehensive throughout Ojai. So where the pavement needs to be for sidewalks, maybe for safe streets, routes to school, or those types of things is one thing. But we need to make sure that there is an overall comprehensive plan for the trails that identifies safety first, and that and the type of surface for the trail and the markings for the trails, and really identify as a priority where there's a disruption in the trails, connectors and disruptors for the trails, and have a plan for the city to actually work on that for long term, how we get those connectors together. So along with, we never actually got to the individual neighborhoods, but that was kind of what we want to see is the overarching, that a neighborhood can't then define, oh gee, I don't want the trail to be this way in my neighborhood. Then we want dirt throughout for horses and that type of thing. And then lastly, I think, was just the idea of, the idea of if a neighborhood wants to have walls in the public right-of-way, and that causes a safety issue for those traveling and using multiple, bikes, pedestrian, horses, that neighborhood's aesthetic need to have a wall in the public right-of-way should be subordinate to the overall community's need to have a safe way of traveling. And that's kind of it. Unless you have something else?
Yeah, I just want to append that with one thought, and that is, this is all through Ojai. Because of the way the city limits are designed, we have a lot of interface with the county.
Yes.
And a lot of our trails are on these margins. And so it's not just a matter of what we can, will, or do, or plan. We also have to involve the county partners to see if they would get on board. And we share the Ojai Valley Trail, which is a county linear park that runs through the middle of our city. And so I think the planning task here is bigger than just a city effort. It goes beyond that.
Okay. What about Steve? Can report for this table? That they've deserted us. But.
Yeah, my group's gone, but I see one over there. We could kind of went in a direction of neighborhood specific, and because they were all from the same neighborhood, which is the Taramina area, or track, if you will. And I think what came out of that was how they feel that a disconnect from what they were seeing in the map, and that perhaps there need to be identified more specifically to their specific area. And so I think that's pretty much what drove our conversation there. And then it was also talked about, and it follows on the coattails of what Kathleen was just saying about cut-through streets and areas. We We have a couple here that lives off of Raymond, and if you know where Raymond is, it is a connector street between Del Oro, a newer tract, to an older neighborhood. And what's happening is, and it gets used quite a bit because it's one of two entries and exits out of that area, the other one being Foothill. So it gets a lot of traffic coming through there, and there's a narrowing of the street, and there have been accidents and things like this. So the conversation kind of centered around traffic calming. What is it going to take to settle things down in that neighborhood?
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's no question that there's several places that were just built originally in a very unique way that need unique recognition. Who wants to? Yes, ma'am.
I think our group feels that the general way that you've delineated neighborhoods probably does reflect the way neighborhoods differ from one another. We actually spent most of our time talking about how Airbnbs could destroy this whole thing. That there will not be neighborhoods if Airbnbs are allowed to proliferate. There won't be any individuals to be a neighborhood. It'll just be transients. So for us, it's like, if they're not going to deal with the Airbnb issue, we might as well not do this process. But if they do this process, we would like to see clear descriptors of each neighborhood, because you can't really go forward either with a zoning protocol or an advisory protocol unless there is a very clear delineation of what's there, what's good about it, and what could be improved.
That's exactly what we're in the process of making.
Should I do this?
Oh, I think, let's go to Steve. Steve's going to show a few slides to update you on some of the work that's already underway on the complete streets, and then I think we'll be wrapped. And then when we come back at the next workshop, we will come back with what you suggest, which is some tightened up descriptors of what makes each neighborhood character area what it is, what's the most important to preserve, what seems to be improvable, and we'll integrate the complete streets work that these guys are doing into that, so you can see the trail network, the pedestrian network, the bike network, sort of threading through these areas.
Sure, I'll make this quick since it's 2 minutes till noon. I'm going to get you out of here by noon.
You have more than 2 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to briefly, no, I'm 2 minutes. I just want to actually start by reiterating briefly what Dave just said, which is that this is an integrated land use transportation planning effort. I'm a transportation planner. I'm going to talk just briefly about transportation, but please understand what I just said. We talked about this before, sort of the animating principles. I think a lot of you I saw at the Charette previously, so you probably heard a lot of this already, but we try to take the approach of, streets should really be safe for all users. That said, you don't have room to do everything you might necessarily want to accomplish in every single street. So you might take a look at the neighborhood context, the context of the street network, and make some choices about here we really need to focus on pedestrians. This might be a good place for bike lanes. That's all this is. Modal priority is kind of a or modal emphasis is a slightly jargony term. I'm not going to talk too much about bikes because we could really get into it. Except to say that that 60% group right up there, that's 3 out of 5 people who would ride a bike more than they do today if there were safer places to ride a bike. Something that's reflected in our draft recommendations. I'm not going to talk about this at all right now, except to say that pedestrian safety is the Y intersection. That's another thing I'm sure some of you we could talk about for a very long time. Crosswalks Downtown is a subject that we've touched on. I think this really cuts 2 ways. It's safety for folks crossing the street, but also we heard a lot about late afternoon sunlight gets in people's eyes when they're driving, and somebody steps out from behind a parked car and you may not see them. There are different ways that we can make that safer. Traffic calming is something that's really, I think, pretty key to this discussion we've been having today about, the character of the different neighborhoods. Similarly, there are different approaches you can take if you want to slow down traffic a little bit, not close the street to traffic, not keep anyone from getting where they want to go, but really get drivers to kind of dial in and pay attention and just slow down and kind of respect the residential neighborhood. There are different strategies for accomplishing this, and these little symbols represent different ways we think you might go about doing this in some key locations that we were able to identify talking to the community through our last meeting. That's it. 12:01. I lied. It took me 3 minutes.
Thank you, Steve. And so the city's website is going to have information about when the next Complete Streets workshop will be, where Steve will give you the more than 3-minute version of that, maybe 4 or 5, yeah. And we will, and also the city's website will announce when the next workshop for this neighborhood planning will occur. I would expect probably in like a couple of months. Does that? Here's Mike.
Okay, so I was just going to say, please sign in and if anybody wants to get information, because the city's kind of working on this new outreach via email. We're kind of doing a lot of things electronic now. So if you have your email address, we're kind of moving towards being able to do email blasts out to people when meetings are occurring. So it's kind of a two-way street instead of you always having to look at our website. So make sure you sign in. And I think the city has been, can you hold up that right there, the postcard that you got? You have it right in front of you? I think we're trying to do a lot more of this type of outreach where we're sending out to everybody, and please let us know if that's been successful. We've done that with the, I think the Airbnb situation and also with this one. So we're trying to reach out more so we get more public participation, so we'd love to hear from you. And I think that's probably about it. We'll have the website and have this will be available for people to watch. That's why we taped it tonight, or today, this morning, I guess I should say. And so I guess that's kind of it.
Was this announced in the newspaper?
I believe so, yeah. We're really attempting to go out lots of different ways in getting people for public participation. But like I said, I think what's really also important is that if you go home and you think of things that are really important, make sure you're contacting us, because that's all about input in. All right, thanks.
And contact your friends too. If you know of other people who are interested but for whatever reason didn't make it, send them emails and forward them emails from the city, so that the word spreads, so that we get anybody who wants to talk about these important subjects has a chance to speak with us and with each other.
Is it 6 to 9?
Can I announce that there's also this whole thing about the parks?
Just a sec.
They're trying to
Yeah.
redo the children's play
Here, hold it.
Can I? One here and one up in the park.
And there was probably 4 people that showed up to the last meeting, maybe 5. So this is really a very important aspect to our community, is the Libby Park play area and the one here at Sarasota. I don't have that.
Good.
So there we go.
Thanks. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Oh, yes, Kathy.
They asked that we also announce the transient rental workshop June 9th, Boyd Center here.
Oh, here. I'll let you do it. Hold on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, June 9th, is it not? Yes, June 9th. Did I say July? I'm sorry, June 9th here at the... No?
No.
Sorry, it's July 2nd. July 2nd.
Oh, okay, July 2nd?
Yeah, July 2nd, we have a facilitator coming in on July 2nd. What was the time, Randy?
Yeah,
6 to 9
I
p.m.
have the time right. Okay.
To facilitate a discussion about transient vacation rentals. And it's going to be here at the Boyd Center, and hopefully we'll get a lot of people coming out and giving their feelings about transient rentals and what they feel they want the city's policy to be regarding them.
And we're gonna be working hard with city staff to sort of unify these different things. I believe the consultant who's going to be one of the consultants that's going to be participating in that is the economist that we have on our team for this work. So in the same way that the city has hired the transportation people to do this complete streets that were already on this neighborhood planning team, the consultant that's going to be, I think, providing you some assistance with the transient rental is the economist that's already on the team for the neighborhood planning. So all those subjects will be integrated as we go ahead, so they don't end up unconnected.
6 to 9, July 2nd, Boyd Center.
I think that's a Thursday.
July 2nd or June 2nd?
July 2nd.
July
Yeah,
2nd.
right. Well, June 2nd is next Tuesday.
Yeah, let's not get everybody confused.
It was like herding cats to get a date.
Right.
Also, due to the cost of making these, should we save these for your next meeting?
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, and if you've
If
scribbled...
someone doesn't want to take it.
Yeah, oh, yes, of course. Well, no, feel free to take it if you want, but if you don't, then we'll keep them here and we'll use them next time. And we'll especially keep the ones that people drew on. So we'll have that. Thank you all very much for coming. It's been a pleasure talking with you.